Really appreciate everybody being here. Thanks for watching online, and welcome to Saving Our Local News, a forum about the future of local news and the Daily Hampshire Gazette, organized by those who bring you the newspaper every day. This event is sponsored by the Pioneer Valley News Guild, the union that has represented all eligible employees of the Daily Hampshire Gazette since 2018. I'm Dusty Christensen. I'm a staff writer at the newspaper, a steward in our newsroom for the union. I'll be moderating tonight's discussion live from the room where my toddler sleeps. As I'm sure you're all accustomed to during this COVID-19 pandemic, virtual gatherings like this are wonderful, but of course they come with the risk of technical difficulties. If we do experience any other problems tonight, please be patient and laugh along with us as we try to figure them out. I want to thank all of our union members who worked so hard to make this forum a reality. We hear some of their voices later tonight, but there were many more who worked on this behind the scenes during many way too late at night phone calls to organize this event. Thank you all so much. Before we begin, I want to note, and this is a reminder to myself too, we are using Zoom's closed captioning function. I'd ask that panelists speak slowly and clearly so that our captions are as accurate as possible. So I'll be joined by 5 panelists tonight. We have with us U.S. Representative Jim McGovern and State Representative Lindsey Sabadosa. Both of their districts, of course, include the city of Northampton. Also joining us is journalist Shaheen Pasha, who's a former UMass Amherst professor, a former Gazette columnist, a longtime reporter who's now teaching at Penn State and running the nonprofit Prison Journalism Project. We have the prominent local activist and champion for working people, Alicia Fleming. She's the co-executive director of Massachusetts Jobs with Justice. And finally, we have Ben Brody, a veteran, war photographer, Southampton resident, who serves as photography director for Report for America and the Ground Truth Project. I want to welcome all of our panelists here. We're going to be hearing from our guests about the diminishing local coverage, about the impact of diminishing local coverage on our region and beyond, but also about some of the ways communities are coming together to fight back against the erosion of their newspapers. A world with stronger, more sustainable newspapers is possible, and that's what we want to focus on tonight. Cities like Philadelphia, to give just one example, have seen their local newspapers become nonprofits and expand coverage, not cut it. With a community united behind change, we believe that that is possible here too. No dream is too big. But before we discuss our hopes and dreams for the future, I want to turn the floor over first to our union chair, staff writer Bera Dunau, for some context about what has happened recently at our paper. Bera, the floor is all yours. And again, I think I just got a note in the comments. Please speak slowly when you talk.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you, Dusty. Hi, my name is Bera Dunau. I am the unit council chair for the Pioneer Valley News Guild. I am also a reporter at the Daily Hampshire Gazette. I've been covering the Pioneer Valley for 3 years. It is an honor and privilege. And in terms of overall journalism, I've been doing this for it'll be 10 years in May, which is something because, you know, like journalism is a profession that will break your heart every single time. That being said, to turn out, but from that small bit of levity, even by that standard, 2020 was a really gutting year for the Daily Hampshire Gazette and those who make it. We lost over half of our staff, mostly through layoffs, but also through buyouts and attrition. And now, after working through a pandemic to inform this community, those of us who remain are feeling overwhelmed. And we want to play the video now so that you can hear directly from some of the folks who make the Gazette or who made the Gazette and hear just some of their voices, if you will.
Technical difficulties, bear with us for just a moment, folks.
I will add, as we're going through difficulties, that the comment thread I'm seeing here is absolutely amazing. Over the course of this pandemic, our union membership has been reduced by 2/3.
As a consequence of the layoffs at the company over the past year, I've been laid off.
I'd like to take a minute to thank the Pioneer News Guild for their successful efforts at getting a good severance package, including health insurance throughout the end of the 2020 year. When the Gazette outsourced production. This was a real lifesaver.
Staff cuts mean we're trying to cover our area in the middle of a global pandemic that's affecting every facet of life and at a time when local news is absolutely critical with less and less resources.
Investigations that should take several days or weeks end up taking months or years to complete.
I think that staffing cuts could affect the amount of help that I could provide per customer.
Staffing cuts have left me as the only member of the sports desk at the Gazette. That means on a daily basis, I'm doing the job of 3 to 4 people.
When one of us is out on vacation, as they are now, we need to call in help from a paginator in Concord, New Hampshire.
And my job is answering the phones, so I get a sense from the community they're concerned too.
But it doesn't have to be this way.
To me, a better, stronger Gazette looks like one that's investing in local news and thinking creatively about how to create a newspaper that can last long into the future as local news is changing.
A stronger Gazette is something that cares more than just about the next day's paper. It's a robust digital presence that has time and resources for the website, video, audio, and other projects beyond just what shows up at people's doorsteps every day.
But I think daily journalism needs to be done from a newsroom, not from isolation. The sooner we get back to that, the better.
A better, stronger Gazette would respect its workers, the ones who actually make the paper.
A better, stronger Gazette has worker protections against outsourcing. A better, stronger Gazette has contract protections against the transfer of ownership.
There has to be a higher level of trust between people at the paper and with the community at large.
This community really needs a newspaper. They deserve a newspaper.
Wow. That was always something when I see that, and Kyle putting that together really was amazing, and hearing the voices of all my fellow workers is moving. And I will say that in addition to everything that you heard in that video, which people will stand by to the hilt, that we're all worried about this increased outsourcing and downsizing at the paper, especially in 2020. This past summer, the Gazette's parent company, Newspapers of New England, outsourced dozens of printing jobs, and it was to the country's largest newspaper corporation, Gannett. Now, the Gazette isn't printed in downtown Northampton anymore. It's printed in Auburn. And this ends a more than 235-year history of printing the Gazette locally. So Newspapers of New England has also put our building on Conn Street up for sale and has laid off many other essential employees. So in addition to our, beloved press operators and our distribution folks, we've lost others like our librarian, our web editor, page designers, feature writers, and the paper's respected editor-in-chief. Finally, the company has been using a lawyer from the union-busting law firm Seyfarth Shaw to negotiate with us at the bargaining table. If you want to have a fun evening, look up Seyfarth Shaw. It's something. But unfortunately, last year was part of a larger trend. Some 200 US counties now have no local paper, and experts are warning of an extinction-level event for many local newspapers amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Studies have shown that communities without a local newspaper face higher levels of corruption and higher costs for local governments. You literally pay for it. And sadly, those news deserts are growing. We cannot continue to go on this way at the Gazette, and we're worried about NNE possibly selling the paper to a larger corporation or hedge fund that would further cut local coverage. At the moment, we have only 4 active news reporters and 2 photographers covering an area of more than 200,000 people. That's Hampshire County plus Holyoke. That means that government meetings go uncovered. Only the shiniest and loudest stories in our communities get attention, and investigative journalism disappears entirely. Aaron Julian, president and CEO of Newspapers of New England, has told us that no sale is in the works. And that's certainly encouraging. We're happy to hear that. But that could change. And if there really is no sale, what is the company's plan? Because it cannot be more of the same. Now, here at the Gazette, we've seen job cuts every year and are forced to do more than with less. And that's been true not just in 2020, but in previous years as well. And yes, right now we are in the middle of a global pandemic, but our bargaining unit has been negotiating with NNE well before these crises. And the company's refusal to agree to cost of living increases and outsourcing protections is just not good enough for we who make the newspaper. You heard from Gazette employees who feel overwhelmed. They feel like the Gazette can be much better. And it can. As a union, we're calling on Newspapers of New England to begin an honest conversation with our community about the future of the paper and investing in its workers. We, the workers, make the newspaper, and we want it to stay vibrant for years to come. And that's where you come in. Lend us your voice to help make a new future possible. Send us an email right now at pvnewsguild@gmail.com. That's pvnewsguild@gmail.com to tell Newspapers of New England to invest in the Gazette. Share with us your hopes about the future of the Gazette. And if you feel so inclined, if you have a literary streak yourself, turn that message into a letter to the editor by sending it to opinion@gazettenet.com. That's opinion@gazettenet.com. Lastly, in the coming weeks, we'll be convening a community working group to begin the process of envisioning a better future for the Gazette. If you're interested in attending, please let us know. And you keep your eyes open for more information and for more things that these workers and this union are going to be doing in the future as we fight to keep this newspaper strong and keep this news local.
Thank you so much, Bera, for those words, and to Kyle for putting that video together. We should note here that we presented Aaron Julian of Newspapers in New England with an invitation to participate in this important forum or to send any other company representative to participate. We received no reply. I want to turn now to our guests who need no introductions, but I'm going to go ahead and introduce them anyways. We've asked each panelist to spend about 3 to 5 minutes speaking about a particular topic. After that, we'll open the floor to questions from our union members, from the public, everybody in this forum here. If you're on Zoom, put your question right in the very handy Q&A function that you'll see on your screen. If you're watching us on Facebook right now, type your comment in the comment section. We do have somebody monitoring those, and be sure to like our page while you're there. With that, I'd like to begin by first turning the floor over to Representative Jim McGovern, who has represented our state's 2nd congressional district since 1997. He's the chair of the House Rules Committee, and we've asked him to discuss the impact of diminishing local coverage on the national and local levels. Representative McGovern, thanks for being with us. The floor is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dusty, and I want to thank you, Bera, and everybody at the Pioneer Valley News Guild, and all of the guests on this call, my colleague Lindsey Sabadosa, and I'm looking forward to hearing everybody's comments. But I'm a big fan of the Daily Hampshire Gazette, the Greenfield Recorder, and all the other fabulous local outlets. And I was listening to Bera's opening remarks talking about how there's a trend in this country where local news outlets are becoming extinct. We talk a lot about food deserts. I do a lot of anti-hunger work, but as you mentioned, we now have news deserts where we have communities that do not have access to local news. Look, I'm in Washington right now, and a few weeks ago on January 6th, I was here in the United States Capitol. It was a sad day for our democracy and hopefully a wake-up call for our country. In terms of dealing with the real world implications of misinformation and conspiracy theories that are out there. About a couple of weeks after the insurrection here on the 6th, I was in a supermarket in Worcester in the frozen food section, and a guy came up to me and challenged me as to whether or not what happened on January 6th actually happened. We got into a little bit of an argument because he said it didn't. It was fake. I said I was there, but he had picked up stuff on the internet where it implied that this was somehow filmed in a studio far away from the Capitol. And it really bothered me because that level of ignorance and unawareness just didn't happen, right? I mean, and we need to constantly be correcting falsehoods and certainly conspiracy theories. The bottom line is that the decline in objective and fact-based journalism has created an environment where information can be weaponized and conspiracy theories can radicalize people into believing that things that happened didn't even happen. And I hope that tonight we can have a robust discussion about how we can push back against this weaponization of disinformation, both at the local and at the national level. Look, people trust local reporters to give fair and impartial information. Yet all across the country, local news is going extinct. This is very bad news for our democracy. If everything is just about the sensationalized reporting that goes on at the national level, and people don't understand how these issues, impact them, it will just further drive people into their own camps and further divide the country. Yeah, I want people to cover what we're doing here in Washington, but equally and probably even more important is that you cover what's going on in the school committees and the city councils and the board of select meetings. And I mean, those are giving people knowledge about that is essential for them to be informed citizens, to be able to participate in the political process. Look, I also think that we have to understand that this to save our local news coverage, and this is why I really applaud you for doing this. This is a community investment. It's a community-wide response that needs to happen here. People need to fight to protect their local news, because if not, it's going to go away. Let me just conclude with this idea. Freedom of the press is not just the freedom of a particular profession or industry. Freedom of the press is yours. The attacks on the press that have gone on for the last 4 years are an attack on the role that journalism plays in a free and open society. It's your right to read what you want, to publish what you want, and to write about what you think. And all of us have a responsibility to protect that right. And I think it starts with understanding the value of local journalism and the critical role it plays in our democracy. To those who are watching, this paper, these journalists, those who work at the paper, they're worth fighting for. They're our brothers and sisters, they're our neighbors in our communities, but they provide an essential service that if we lose it, you're going to see more January 6th in the future. So this is a serious matter, and I am grateful for the opportunity to be with you, and I thank you very much.
Representative McGovern, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about that important topic. We're going to turn now to Alicia Fleming, who is a very familiar face to anyone involved in social justice activism here in Western Massachusetts. Alicia is a lifelong resident of Western Mass and has been involved in many civil rights and economic justice, racial justice struggles in our region. She's co-executive director of Massachusetts Jobs with Justice, and we've asked her to discuss a bit about what the loss of local coverage means for communities. Alicia, thanks so much for joining us. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much, Dusty, and thank you to everybody here. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this event. It's really quite an honor to be part of such an incredible panel of individuals devoted to advocating for our Western Mass communities. For me personally, and for Massachusetts Jobs with Justice, local news coverage is really an integral part of the struggle for equity in our communities. It's also an economic justice issue when a company like Newspapers of New England outsources our community's work and tries to strip cost of living increases away from its workers at the bargaining table. At the Gazette, 13 workers were laid off in March, including the paper's only reporter of color. Then in July, the company outsourced printing of the paper, as Barra mentioned, to the nation's largest newspaper corporation. And that history, that more than 235-year history of printing the paper locally, as a lifelong Western Massachusetts resident, the history is important to me personally, and it's something that I'm proud of. That outsourcing meant that 29 people lost work during the pandemic, and then in December, 7 more staffers were lost through buyouts or layoffs. In the midst of the pandemic, especially, it's so disheartening to see people lose their jobs, and it places such a huge additional burden on the staff who remain. Coverage of city government, city schools is so essential to ensuring that we have transparency and to disseminating the information that's pertinent to our community members. Decisions in the institutions, affect everyone in some fashion. And when reporters can't cover those events, or when the coverage is sporadic, elected officials and decision makers are essentially operating without the oversight of their constituency. For us, for organizers, and for all of our community members, knowledge is in fact power. And in a moment when so many of us are seeing our power in the workforce, our power in our communities diminished, what we need is more knowledge. We need more coverage, not less. When newspapers lose staff, the community also loses the depth of coverage. And what that means is that people in power are more frequently quoted, and the voices of people who do not hold positions in traditional power structures in their community are amplified less. Personally, I want to know what my fellow community members are experiencing. I want to hear alternating viewpoints. I want to see the entire diverse spectrum of the Pioneer Valley reflected in our local news coverage. With limited staffing, reporters are more likely to be drawn to the same official, quote unquote, sources of information, especially if they're required to file multiple stories a day. We need staffing that allows reporters to take a day, walk around the neighborhoods, talk to people about pressing everyday issues that affect them in their lives. Issues like food insecurity, substandard housing, education, public health. A year or so ago, I read a story about a man who was shot in his home by the police. It wasn't in another region. It wasn't in another state. It was right here in Western Mass. And what was so striking to me was that the only point of view to be amplified by the news coverage was the point of view of those in official positions of power. I personally think it's important that we have news coverage that focuses on all of the pertinent viewpoints of a story. We recently spent a summer watching uprisings happening across our own state, then across the nation and across the globe. And I couldn't help but marvel at how this very thing had happened right here in Western Mass. And I was surrounded by community members who had no idea that it had happened at all. We need local news to ensure that we have accurate information, to ensure that we can hold people in power accountable. I'm personally so proud to be a part of this Western Mass community and just so in love with this region that is my home. And local coverage is really just such an essential part of keeping Western Mass a place where we all love to live.
Alicia, thank you so much for that. It's so great to hear your words. Up next, we're going to move to Southampton's own Ben Brody. He's an independent photojournalist, former Army combat photographer. His excellent work, including his book, Attention Service Member, has focused on the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and their aftermath. He currently serves as Director of Photography for the Ground Truth Project and Report for America. Ben will be speaking a little bit about the importance of local photojournalism and its future, where it goes, his area of expertise. Ben, thanks so much for joining us. The floor is now yours.
Thanks so much for having me, Dusty, and thank you all for being here. Yeah, I mean, I think these broad arguments about how local journalism is an essential function of a democracy and a important public utility are right on. So speaking to the sort of the more microclimate of the medium of photography, I mean, I think while local news is facing unprecedented cutbacks and layoffs, news deserts are expanding, local photography has had it an order of magnitude worse. The situation that photojournalists face is that publishers and owners have decided that photojournalists don't create value for the newsroom commensurate with their salaries. So I'm not going to just say, yes, they do. Our photographers make great pictures. They've won many awards and leave it at that. The truth now is that local photojournalism has to resell its value to the newsroom. And that involves photojournalists adapting to the changing needs of their communities. So I spent plenty of my early career dashing around, snapping quick pictures of subjects as they talk to a reporter or do their job, so there can be a picture for every story in the paper. But if that's the photojournalist's primary role, a writer with a smartphone and a few days of training can fill that gap 70–80% of the way. Another argument about spending finite resources on staff photographers is that bystanders with smartphones cover spot news very effectively. Certainly the most earth-shaking images from 2020 were made by regular people using their phones to hold police accountable. A savvy reporter can find that imagery even before it goes viral by being in the right Facebook group or having the right contacts, as I'm sure you all know. audiences look at creative, engaging photography all day long now on their screens. And this sort of wide angle, telephoto zoom aesthetic of conventional photojournalism looks dated and it lacks creative energy. And when these pictures are rushed, it just compounds that quality issue. So I think staff photojournalists need to get serious about how contemporary photography has changed in the last 20 years, start challenging these old assumptions about what photojournalism is supposed to look like and how these photographic decisions, whether they're intentional or unintentional, reflect on their communities. So at Report for America, I try to cultivate photojournalists who add value to their newsrooms by reimagining the photographer's role in their newsroom and their impact on the community. So over the last 2 years, I've gathered a lot of evidence that photographers add tremendous value to a newsroom when they're committed to reflecting their community using the tools of restorative narratives and solutions journalism, while they're still engaging with a contemporary visual zeitgeist. So advertisers can be persuaded to buy space on these pages with exciting photography. Communities want to feel like the media really sees who they are. In communities where crime is the media's primary focus, the medium of photography is uniquely effective in showing how these communities are actually very close-knit and people love their home regardless of its problems. So to accomplish this, photographers really have to be on equal footing with writers. If they collaborate, there needs to be a discussion about how the interaction of image and text will harmonize effectively. Photographers need the time and the agency to hang out in their communities, create visually driven works that represent their communities deeply and fairly. And that means there's not going to be a picture of every person who got interviewed, and that's totally okay. So when I hear a publisher or managing editor I'm courting for Report for America tell me they can't afford to hire a photographer, I'm happy to tell them why they can't afford not to hire a photographer. Photographers I recommend at Report for America as the finalists, they're all experts in this strategy, delivering maximum value and service to the community. Make sure they have the mentorship and support they need when they're often the only visual professional in the newsroom. So fortunately, the Gazette already has an outstanding staff photographer and a photo editor with the experience to mentor an early career photojournalist. So that's Gazette's actually in a better place than a lot of the newsrooms that I work with. As far as the sort of multitasking between the medium of photography and the medium of writing, I actually always recommend that a photographer learn the craft of writing. And it's not always a great idea. It's never a great idea to try and be a serious photographer and a serious writer at the same moment. Photographers will always benefit from thinking about pictures the way a writer thinks about the narrative structure of a story. Like a writer needs to create a highly legible lead, establish location, intimacy, proximity, introduce characters and describe their physicality, create an atmosphere using the periphery. These are all things that photographers should be doing as well. So local journalism is in a fight for survival. This is how I fight for photography, using what resources I can muster at Report for America.
Ben, thank you so much for that. Moving along, we next have Shaheen Pasha, who many people will recognize as a former Gazette columnist, former UMass Amherst professor. She's a veteran journalist who's covered a wide range of topics for Reuters, CNN, Dow Jones, you name it, many outlets. She's the founder of the nonprofit Prison Journalism Project, which helps incarcerated writers and those in communities impacted by incarcerations tell stories about their world using the tools of journalism. We've asked her to talk a bit about the importance of a strong local newspaper and what different better journalism models look like. Shaheen, thanks so much for joining us. The floor is now yours.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And it's kind of like a homecoming in a way for me, because I'm now in Pennsylvania. So I'm really happy to be here. And yeah, and especially because, honestly, the local community and the Gazette was a very significant part of my life while I was there. I actually had the privilege of writing the column under Brookhauser, who was one of the best editors that I've ever worked with. And I think one of the good things about working at that time was that local journalism, as I was trying to do it through my column and the way with the colleagues that I worked with, it was about really sort of how do we reach the communities, the marginalized communities in Western Mass. And I think that the fact that we're seeing newspapers like the Gazette being decimated, one of the biggest impacts that you are going to see and that we are seeing is that the communities that have traditionally been, shut down or overlooked, they're the ones that are getting the primary impact. And for me as a columnist, I had the ability to actually write about people of color, act as a woman of color, talk about being Muslim at a time when there were Muslim bans and all this stuff. And that was important because there was a lot of pushback in the community too about these stories, and you need to have that conversation. So when you wind up seeing local journalism shutting down, and you wind up basically seeing it covered from what I consider almost like parachute journalism, that only when something big happens, somebody from outside the community parachutes in, they talk to a few people, get a very vague idea of what the real issue is, and then go back and write about it, you don't get the services, you don't get the change that is needed in a community, especially when it comes to marginalized communities. For me, it's interesting because the seeds of the Prison Journalism Project, which is the nonprofit that I run now, the nonprofit newsroom, in some ways were planted by the whole concept of local community journalism. I was teaching at the Hampshire County Jail in Northampton. I was teaching incarcerated men there how to do journalism, and we were working with UMass students and the students inside the jail to be able to create these stories. And one of these epiphanies that I had in one of these moments was that prison, this national prison mass incarceration problem we have, is a community. It's a community journalism problem, because right now we have people from the outside coming in and telling the stories about incarcerated people, and there are no correspondents in this 2.3 million incarcerated world. How do you have a community without local correspondence? And that immediately made me think of, that's the importance of community journalism. It's to make sure that that doesn't happen. But to be honest, once the seed was planted, this was something that I wanted to do, but funding is an issue. And also having individuals think outside the box when it comes to how to run a newsroom that might be a little bit alternative to what we've traditionally seen. And I think that is where we really need to rethink. Right now, when it comes to the industry, it's all about work harder, work harder, work harder, work harder, do the job of 10 people, right? As opposed to work smarter. How do we find alternative ways to be able to tell these stories? And how do we make sure that when we are looking at these alternative ways, that we focus on especially the communities that are marginalized? Because that's sort of my area. And I think one of the areas that really community journalism is supposed to do. Nonprofit journalism, though, is challenging. It's one of these areas that it is not a magic wand, right? I wish it was. I'd be a gazillionaire, but it's not. It is something that does require us to really be pounding the pavement a lot of times, and it really comes down to making others, corporations and foundations, and honestly, everyday donors, members, really start to see a vision of what it could be. And I think that as local journalism, what I think is really important about the Gazette is that the community cares about it. I think there's a lot of people in the community that want to see what the vision is and want to see, how can we help? How can we participate? And that's sort of the core and the crux of what nonprofit journalism is. It's about bringing people inside, and it's almost like a community itself to support it. So you're seeing some really great examples that have emerged. You have the Vermont Digger, you have the Texas Tribune, you have the 19th News, which is specifically focused on telling gender and social equality issues and stories. And these are all a mixture of different funding models. For me, bringing it back to personal thing, I wanted to do this, from the minute this idea came to launch the Prison Journalism Project. But once again, it comes down to institutional funding. Couldn't do the institutional funding where I was, I had to go elsewhere. And so Penn State kind of stepped in, and Penn State was able to fund it. And that is what also happens. You have to wind up, sometimes you have to move, literally, physically move, to be able to create a larger vision. And I think we're seeing in the community right now that there's been a move to do stuff, but it's harmful. It's not being done in a good way. We're getting rid of economic opportunities and jobs, and really the local people who know the stories best. So I think when it comes to nonprofit journalism and kind of where the vision is potentially for a local community newspaper, I think it's really about reassessing the whole model, right? What are we doing right? What have we looked at traditionally that we need to maybe evolve a little bit and be able to convince the community to help with that as well. With my nonprofit, it is a challenge. We go out there and we're pitching stuff, but we do find people that are like-minded. And I know in this community too, there's a lot of like-minded individuals that want to see this actually succeed and be something that carries on. But it really comes down to how do we change the model a little bit? Because the model is not working. The model has not been working in a long time. And what we're seeing is that the key players that have made that newspaper so strong, from the printers to the editors, are being discarded in favor of just really short-term solutions without looking at the longer-term impact. And I think when you're looking at nonprofit journalism, that's one of the things we really kind of think of. What is the long-term impact of who we're trying to cover, what stories we're trying to tell, who we want to be part of this like family to tell these types of stories. So I think for me, when I looked at the Gazette, it was a family for me. I would talk to people online, and I would, emails, and there was a family, there was a community there. And I think that that's what we need to get to, kind of rethinking how we see news today and viewing it more in the prospects of how do we get everybody to kind of get involved and see the strength and the power of it, and to actually put their money where their mouth is and where their heart is. So I think that's going to be a big challenge. It is a challenge, but it's absolutely something that can be done, and we need to start thinking about it that way definitely, for sure.
Shaheen, thank you so much for that. And I'm hoping we can get to some of those questions in the Q&A about what the path is forward. I also want to remind people that we're hoping to convene a sort of a working group with community members, hopefully with the newspaper as well, and newspapers in New England, so we can begin to answer these questions together as a community. I want to move to our final panelist. Last but not least, we have State Representative Lindsey Sabadosa. Lindsey Sabadosa is the first woman ever elected to represent the 1st Hampshire district, which of course includes Northampton. And prior to running for office, was a community organizer who fought for all kinds of issues like reproductive justice, universal health care. Representative Sabadosa also headed the Pioneer Valley Women's March. And we've asked her to speak tonight a little bit about the importance of a strong Gazette and how the community can support the Gazette's workers, what a better Gazette looks like. Representative Sabadosa, thanks so much for being here and for being patient. The floor is now yours.
Thank you so much. And I'm just going to correct you for 1 second because you used the past tense. I am still fighting for all of those things, even if I'm not a community organizer and I'm a legislator. So I just want to start off by saying the Gazette, for those who don't know, was founded in 1786. And the first article that they wrote about was Shays' Rebellion. Okay, let's just let that sink in for a second, that is the history of this newspaper, covering one of the first major events in a newly formed country. And that's amazing. And the Gazette has continued in that history of covering incredible, important stories to this region. And I am looking at the reporters from the Gazette, both past and present, who are here this evening, and I am thinking about the incredible work that they have done and that they have caused enormous change in the community because of that investigative reporting. The Gazette, unlike no other newspaper, I will say in this state, but probably in the whole country, covered what happened at Hampshire College. They kept Hampshire College open. It is because of them that people in this community still have a job, that there are students on this campus, and that Hampshire College will continue to go on and thrive. That's because of the Daily Hampshire Gazette. Now, not as successful, but the Daily Hampshire Gazette also covered Holyoke Medical Center and the birthing center. And they raised and elevated the issue of what was happening to people who were trying to give birth and the elimination of a birthing center in a community that created a desert of care. That's the Daily Hampshire Gazette. That's the work that these people do every single day. And we should be so proud to have them here. And I am grateful for that. And I take what is happening to this newspaper very personally, because not only have I watched the way coverage has changed as we've seen layoff after layoff, but I have also, unfortunately, had to help many of the former Gazette employees through their unemployment. And that makes it something that keeps me up at night. Thank you. Someone just put in the chat about the Holyoke Soldiers Home. Another great point. That was, again, the work of the Gazette. So what are we seeing as people are losing their jobs and our newspaper is getting smaller and smaller? We're seeing a real change in coverage. Under Brookhauser, the Gazette decided that they were going to start covering Holyoke, which was one of the best and most powerful changes that could happen because Holyoke does not have a local newspaper. And so breaking down that barrier between the Pioneer Valley and Hampden County, that was essential. But as people get laid off and the newspaper gets thinner, less coverage of Holyoke. We're starting to see a bleed between Franklin and Hampshire County, articles that are run in the Recorder, and I will say with a great deal of cynicism that unfortunately employees at the Recorder are not unionized. And so I wonder sometimes why so many articles from the Recorder keep showing up in the Gazette that do not lack that same local coverage, that do not provide that perspective. I will tell you that I have been at meetings that were covered by the Recorder where they only covered the representatives from Franklin County and left all of us in Hampshire County out. Now, Alicia said really well, you need to stop hearing from the elected officials, you need to start hearing from real people. I feel very confident that if Dusty or Bera or Greta were the person covering that story, that meeting about unemployment would not have been a bunch of elected officials talking about what we're doing, but would have talked to people who are really unemployed and who are going through these issues, because that's what people need to know. Just the other day, there was an article, and I'll cite it because it really struck me. It was a full page, and it was about brothels in Nevada and how they're dealing with COVID. And it struck me because I thought, geez, I bet we have sex workers in Western Massachusetts who are also struggling with COVID and trying to figure out how they're going to make ends meet. And why is nobody covering that? We need our newspaper to come back to us and to have that local focus that is just so critical. And I like big ideas. I like big, bold, radical ideas. So when I talk to Dusty, I'm like, employee owned. How do we do it? How do we make this newspaper a community newspaper? Is it turning it into a nonprofit? Is it making it a subscriber owned newspaper? Because if any place in the state of Massachusetts can do it, it will be Northampton. We all know that. You're all here. We have 160 people on this call. I hope all of you will join the community forums that these amazing people are working on, and that you will not only show up, but you will put your dollars in, because it takes money to have local journalism. But local journalism matters, because you do not need to hear from, I love Jim, but you don't need to hear from Jim and I all the time. You need to hear from the people whose lives depend on having real local coverage. So thank you so much for having me tonight. And I just look forward to supporting all of you.
Wow, thank you so much to all of our panelists, Representative Sabadosa and the rest. We've got a lot to chew on there, so much to think about. I want to be sure we get to as many questions as possible. So we're going to open up the floor for discussion now. There's been a lot of great questions in the Q&A. Some people have emailed questions as well. Very quickly, before we do that, I want to remind our viewers here that we're asking people to send an email to pvnewsguild@gmail.com. I know people have been posting it in the chat. Thank you. To share with us your hopes about the future of the Gazette and how you think some of this might be possible. As reporters, as newspaper workers, we do our jobs very well. But we're going to rely on the community to figure out the solutions forward here to some of these issues. We'll also be sure that newspapers in New England receive some of those messages. And if you want to make them into a letter to the editor, again, the email for that is opinion@gazettenet.com. So like I said, we're going to try to answer as many questions as we can before our time is up. So I'd like to ask our panelists to keep their answers brief here. And again, if you want to submit a question, type one in the Q&A box on Zoom, or drop a comment on our Facebook live stream and like our page while you're there. I saw one question. We had a question from our union members that sort of dovetailed with a question in the chat from one of our former members, Chad. This question will go to Representative McGovern. Obviously, other panelists feel free to chime in as well. During the last legislative session, you were a co-sponsor of the Local Journalism Sustainability Act, which would have given tax credit for folks, I believe, subscribing to local newspapers or supporting local news outlets. That's one of several bills that have been introduced but haven't passed yet through Congress. That would help local news outlets. I know, for example, Sherrod Brown, the I believe Ohio senator, has talked about creating a kind of corporation for public broadcasting, but for newspapers instead. There's all these ideas floating around. What were some of the pros and cons of that particular idea, Representative McGovern? Will similar legislation be introduced? You're a part of Democratic leadership. What's the chance of something like that passing? And what do you think the role of the federal government is in preventing the continued decline of local newspapers or the gobbling up of those newspapers by hedge funds?
Well, that's a big question. But look, I think there is a responsibility to help keep local newspapers viable, and whatever the the combination of things that we need to do, we ought to do them, and including, providing funding and finding more ways to incentivize, the local newspapers, but also finding ways to disincentivize some of the, some of these outside forces that are basically, making lots of money, but have taken away your business. And I think that's something that I'd love to sit down and talk with the reporters in the union about, how we can, come together. But, look, this conversation that we have had here tonight highlights the importance of saving our local newspapers. I mean, everything from Alicia talking about, giving voice to people that obviously sometimes don't have a voice. But if you have a vibrant local newspaper, you can lift their voices up. They can be heard. We all learn from that, right? So I will work with all of you to figure out, of the legislation that's out there, which is the best one for us to get behind. But look, we have a different Congress now. And so things that were not at all possible, a few months ago, they are possible now. So let's see how we can work with you in the short term and in the long term.
I want to follow up with that to include a conversation that was in the chat from Chad LeBaron, a former employee of the Gazette, talking specifically about antitrust legislation. I'm sure that relates to the large corporations and hedge funds that have been gobbling up newspapers, whether
Right.
it is Gannett or Alden Global Capital, which just purchased Tribune Publishing. There is this increasing consolidation in the industry. What is it that Congress can do in order to strengthen regulations and laws to prevent that kind of consolidation in our vital industry?
We ought to strengthen laws and regulation. That's to combat it. I mean, that's what we need to do. And I'm happy to have a conversation with Sherrod Brown and others who are thinking in those terms. But look, I think when we think about worst outcomes, I mean, obviously, if local newspaper shut down, that's a terrible outcome. Also, a terrible outcome is if the local newspaper is gobbled up, by some big corporation, or some big gigantic, news agency that doesn't give a damn about what happens in our local community. I mean, look, the reason why we're on this call here today is because we all understand the value of making sure that the voices and the lives of the people who live in our area, are respected and are raised up. And if hedge funds and corporations and big gigantic newspaper chains gobble up the Hampshire Gazette for whatever reason, and we're not saying that that's going to happen. We hope it doesn't. But if it does, then the paper ceases to be special, right? It ceases to be all the things that we have talked about here today that are so valuable. So I will. I'm ready to get to work on this.
The next question is from our members, and it's for Alicia Fleming. Alicia, the hope of this forum is obviously to envision a better local news ecosystem here in Massachusetts. I was very struck by the anecdote that you gave about somebody being shot and only the official by police, and only the official narrative of people in power being the one that many people in the community were familiar with. What kind of stories do you feel like are undercovered by news outlets here in the Valley and in the region in general? What are the stories that we should be telling that we're not telling?
Oh goodness, I could go on about this for hours. We don't hear the voices of marginalized people. We don't hear about the multitude of victims of police brutality in our communities. And believe me when I say that they exist. That anecdote I gave you should probably surprise you to know that not only was that man shot twice in his home, but that he was then charged with assault on the police officers who shot him. And I stumble as I say this because as a Black woman, it frightens me to even say this in a public forum. And that's a really important thing to note, is that for marginalized people, there's a sense of fear in speaking out for ourselves. And we rely on local journalism in order to give voice to our struggles and our marginalization. It's an integral part, again, of achieving the equity that, we all know that we need to see in our communities. I live in a community that doesn't have vibrant local coverage. I live in the second largest community in Western Massachusetts, and our coverage is sparse. The stories that we did, I say we, but I'm not a journalist. The stories that the organizing that I've been a part of, that the Gazette covered, such as the birthing center, that was a really important story. We need more stories like that. We need, again, more stories to give voice to folks who are marginalized. We need more investigative reporting around the corruption in our communities, because it's happening, but we don't know that it's happening because, you know, the people who are corrupt are not going to announce it to us. We need more stories about the labor struggles that are happening in our communities. We need to hear more about the workers who deserve hazard pay. We need to hear more from you know, the, I guess, 2.5 million now women who have been forced to leave the workforce. We need to hear more stories from educators who are putting their lives on the line every day to educate our students, and yet at this point, to my knowledge, are still not in line for vaccinations. We need to hear less from our elected officials, despite my great love for the two who are on this call, and we need to hear more from the people who are impacted by the policy decisions that they make.
I want to put that same question to you, Shaheen Pasha. And there's also a great question for you in the Q&A, and that is, how did you get your nonprofit off the ground? Seems like a big question here is the money question. Did you approach individuals, a foundation? Yeah, Shaheen, the floor is yours.
Yeah, to answer the second part of that first, institutional support. In my case, institutional support came from Penn State. They helped, they saw the vision for what I wanted to do on a national level, and they were willing to put money towards it. And that is one of the things I think that really we need to do. We need to be, you know, basically out there lobbying people that can provide institutional support, can provide corporate support, can provide, you know, wealthy donors, to make them see the possibilities about, you know, variations in the traditional journalism model. I mean, I think that I was cheering as Alicia was talking, because, you know, from my time in the Valley, I mean, I absolutely 100% agree with all of that. And I think that what also needs to happen is that we need to make sure that the impetus and the motivation is also there from the management level of the newspapers to tell those stories. Because I think one of the other issues that has to be addressed, especially as we're trying to build it, is to make sure that, you know, people at the top are willing to put the extra energy towards getting those stories out. The reporters are. I mean, the community reporters are fantastic, right? And we need to make sure that that always remains something that from the top, that actually is reflected in the coverage. Because as my experience as a journalist, you know, oftentimes things get just shut down. You know, you say something and that said, well, that's too niche, we can't talk about that. And when you were talking about, you know, police brutality, when you know, there's also this whole like, well, our community is pro-police, so we can't do that. There's all of these fears that kind of come with it. And I think as a newspaper, as a publication, that has to be addressed as well. And I think one of the ways, in terms of a larger, like, I'm part of the our organization is part of the Institute for Nonprofit News, and you know, there's like a couple hundred members of that, but you'll still see that the big players like the ProPublica and, like, you know, like the big names are still the ones that the foundations are like putting most of the funds towards. And I think that also comes from, we have to start in some ways getting people to change their mind, advocating for that, which is what I'm doing, to sort of show, okay, you know, it's a small publication, but this is why this is important. And this is, you want to be on the right side of history, right? And local journalism, the way it's going right now, is on the wrong side of history. It's being completely depleted, which is creating this news desert. We need to be able to show this now. New administration, new, you know, society, all this stuff that we're talking about, we fought for. Now we need to show, okay, it's got to be down from the grassroots level. It's got to be down from the small publication to the top, right? Because that's where the change doesn't happen. We've seen that during election. The change doesn't happen from a national level. It happens from the small, right? So we need to be the ones out there, you know, expressing too. And honestly, I have no problems with corporations giving money if I believe they keep out of it, right? But when you're doing it as a nonprofit model or some kind of a model like that, where you are funding it, but you're like the 19th News, for instance, takes corporate money, right? Takes foundation money, but it has a a wall there. You cannot be a part of the coverage, and that has to be a part of it as well. I'm all for, government helping to improve antitrust laws and doing all of that, but that doesn't mean that that the government has a say or in any way, shape, or form is able to have its political agenda coming through. These are real fears that also come when you're looking at alternative models, alternative funding, how that is going to shape coverage. So I think there's many different ways of doing it, but it can be done. I absolutely 100% believe it can be done.
You mentioned public funding, which I think is a question that a number of people have asked some question about in the chat. I'm going to put this one to Ben Brody and to sort of try to synthesize some of the questions that have been asked in the Q&A. What do you make of public, government or taxpayer funding going towards journalism? I think for some journalists, there's a sense to cringe at the government funding their journalism. They want to be independent. But of course, there are also amazing outlets like NPR or the BBC in England that are publicly funded and do good journalism. What do you make of this question of public funding? And what do you think are some of the possible solutions to this crisis local news really is facing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think public funding is one strategy that you can use to address funding shortfalls. In my own experience with like Stars and Stripes, for example, which gets 30% of its funding from the DoD. And, I've been in the editorial room there. There's no, they piss the Pentagon off all the time, but I don't know. So our strategy at Report for America is we solicit big money from philanthropic organizations. Like we're a finalist for the MacArthur's $100 million grant right now, fingers crossed for next month when we find out. But we also help newsrooms find local sources of funding. And I think that is actually sort of a force multiplier in terms of community engagement. When people are funding the newspaper, they pay attention to what they're paying for. And I found that to be a really promising source of growth in our newsrooms that we work with Report for America. Yeah, and and our development folks work with the newsrooms to help them with this task that may be outside the scope of their expertise as well.
There's a question here in the chat. I think I've got two questions here for Representative Sabadosa. One of them I can partially answer as a member of the union. This is from Karen Brown, maybe Karen Brown from New England Public Media. If so, hello, Karen. What can the community do? Should they be subscribing more, visiting the Gazette website, or more direct form of activism? My immediate answer to that as a reporter and union member would be yes, subscribe, always subscribe. You really, it really is important that folks try to support as much as they can their local news. In terms of more direct forms of activism, that's certainly what we're hoping to begin here with this conversation, convening a community stakeholder group to start actually trying to figure out these solutions. And be sure, I will always plug, our union activism at the Gazette. Be sure to follow what we as workers are hoping to do in terms of activism as we fight for a fair contract for ourselves and for the sustainability of this paper. At the bargaining table, we've asked for everything from outsourcing protections, which would obviously help in some manner, to other things that would be important to helping preserve our newspaper. Representative Sabadosa, what do you think the community can do in terms of supporting the Gazette and this important work moving forward? And then I'll have another more legislative focused question for you after that.
Well, I think that the answer of subscribing is super important. Absolutely subscribe. I think though that the other important piece is to continue to push back, right? So if you see things that are happening in the community that aren't covered, then you do need to write to the newspaper and let them know. And it's not because our local journalists don't want to cover them, it's because they're not giving the resources to do that. So constant and consistent feedback, I think, is going to be really important moving forward.
So onto the legislative note, we had a great question, and this is one that also came from some of our own members. One of our Boston College reporters, interns wrote about this for the paper the other day. Tom Gardner wrote in the Q&A section, I testified at the State House in support of Rep. Lori Enrlich's bill, sorry about my pronunciation, to set up a statewide commission to address the issue of news deserts. Now that commission is being established, I'm wondering if the union will be part of the deliberations and what ideas any of you have on solutions to stem the tide of closing and shrinking news staffs, nonprofit, government supportive, et cetera. We've answered some of those questions here, but on the questions of this committee, you know, how can we guarantee that that our voices out here, the voices of our representatives here in Western Mass, are part of that process, and that it doesn't simply just become a committee that has wonderful discussions about a problem and does nothing to solve it?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So the commission to study journalism deserts was one of the bills that passed in the very last moment of the session on January 5th. It was filed by Representative Ehrlich, whose own daughter is a journalist. So she has a lot of insight into the profession. But, you know, I think that we can make sure that Western Mass is included, that the Connecticut River Valley, rather, is included in that conversation. And I'm happy to make sure that that really does take place. I guess I would say, though, it's great that that commission is set up, but I also think that the situation of the Gazette is something that requires more urgent action. So rather than relying on the commission to come up with ideas and solutions for us, I think that we need to lead and then tell the commission how they should be solving this problem in other communities. Because frankly, we don't have a year or 18 months to wait for a commission to come up with ideas. It's just not how it's going to work. And I personally care too much about this newspaper to see us put things off, waiting for the state or for our body to come up with an answer.
Thanks so much, and certainly would agree that you know, in terms of folks needing more immediate action, that's certainly something that we'll be advocating as a union to begin, you know, having these conversations as a community, and hopefully with the ownership as well. You know, we've been working hard as reporters, as newspaper workers, to continue to inform the community, and it gets harder and harder, as you've heard, with some of the decisions that ownership has made. I do, on that note, want to turn to a question from our members for Shaheen Pasha. You've worked in many newsrooms as a reporter. As I was saying, you know, when cuts happen, you know, it makes it hard to do the kind of reporting that we do. We do that reporting in spite of newspapers in New England's decisions to cut staff. I don't think members of the public are perhaps aware, though, of the time-intensive nature of many kinds of reporting. Can you talk a little bit about what it means when journalists are rushed to produce quick stories, more stories, because of understaffing?
Yeah, I mean, when I was saying before that we have to start, we've been in this model of just work harder, work harder, work harder. What happens is when you just push that narrative that if you just work harder, you'll be able to do everything, quality suffers. Reporting takes time. Reporting takes meeting people outside of the quick quote that you can get from somebody who is very, you know, who likes the media and wants to talk, because that's not where the real stories are going to come from. The stories are going to come from you developing those sources, going out there, taking time to actually meet with people who distrust you, right? To get them to understand that, you know, you're there to tell their stories. And so when you're finding right now with these massive job cuts and these layoffs, one person is doing the job of 5, really. You know, we already saw that in the video. One person is doing the job of 5. How on earth are you supposed to be out in the community, meeting people that you don't already know, actually out there, finding out what the legitimate stories and concerns and problems are in the community if you are stuck to your desk, which is what's happening, right? Because if you are there and working 5 jobs in one, you are stuck to your desk. Your reporting is maybe an email. It's trying to get a phone call. That is not how we build relationships. And especially when it comes to community journalism, that is all it is. It's about relationships. It's about getting people to trust you enough to give you the inside scoop, to really shed light. Our job, and I've been teaching journalism for many years now, and one of the things I first tell people, it's about, you know, we're there as watchdogs. We're there as watchdogs, but we're also there as observers and listeners. Right now, the way the current model is, where you can do more, you can do this, just, you know, it's cutting in on quality because it cuts in on fact checking. It makes sure that you only get a very limited number of people who potentially are media savvy and know how to manipulate to get the right quote out, to get the right angle, that right angle of the story out. Makes you rely on, PR people more, because it's easier and because there's no humanly possible way you can create a publication. And I think one of the problems is that, we're forgetting that journalists, our job is to basically amplify. I don't like to say that we're the voice. I don't want to be the voice of anybody. I want to amplify other people's voices. And right now, especially in communities where there's traditionally been, marginalization, where they don't trust the media, right? You coming in for 5 seconds saying, I'm going to tell your story, is not met with anything other than you're going to tell your version of the story, so I'm not going to talk to you. You're not amplifying those voices, and that is the heart of community journalism. So I think that people really need to understand, aside from the economic impact, which is huge, of having all of these operations moved out of the community, every aspect of coverage it has to be done fast, which means it can't be fact checked the same way, which means you're going to make mistakes, then you're going to build on the distrust that we already have of fake news in this environment. And it's not necessarily completely the reporter's fault. It's because they're trying to do too much at the same time. So this just has a ripple effect, and actually has a larger, when it's happening in the community, it has a larger national impact, because it's the community that starts distrusting the media. And then they're not believing what's happening. If they're sitting in Amherst and they don't trust what's happening locally, they're not believing what's happening in Washington, D.C. if an insurrection happens, frankly. And that really does stem from just being overworked and not giving those options to reporters now to work properly. I'm passionate about this one because this one pisses me off.
I felt you on that one a lot. Right. Thank you so much, Shaheen. Some of these questions are really good ones, and sadly, like I said, we did invite newspapers in New England to be part of this forum in order to answer some of these important questions. They did not even respond to us or agree to send another company representative. We would have been happy with anybody. Some of these questions, though, are interesting. I know Natalia Munoz is here from Holyoke Media. Hi, asking whether we've recommended to the company to reach out to some of the big foundations, MacArthur, Knight Rider, etc. We ourselves have not. I think it's a great idea and something that they certainly could be doing. There's a number of these questions I just want to sort of get out into the ether here and sort of put out where this is going to be on social media later. Maybe these are some questions that the company will answer at some point. Let's see here. We had some questions about in terms of what has been done to increase subscriptions, whether to subscribe to the digital version, to the print version, what can be done to increase community participation. I will say that as a union, a number of times we raised the possibility of doing a subscription drive, for example, or sort of figuring out what things we can suggest to the company for them to do that important work of getting subscribers. Unfortunately, we haven't really had much engagement on that issue. Let's see. I want to keep us for maybe about 5-6 more minutes, answer 1 or 2 more questions, and then we can let our panelists go. We'll be sure to try to answer a lot of these questions via email if we have not answered them during the panel. We will obviously be sure to stay in touch with people moving forward about what our next steps are, in terms of organizing community stakeholders to figure out what our next steps are, and also as a union, what our next steps are in our labor struggle at the Gazette. Just a few more questions here. I want to end on a bit more of a positive note. This can be something that everybody answers. Maybe we'll start with you, Ben Brody. Tell us, what would a stronger Gazette look like to you?
A stronger Gazette would double down on hyper-local coverage, to have reporters dedicated to specific coverage gaps and specific news deserts. Like, a reporter is basically just working on Holyoke, and maybe a reporter and a photographer. And we could talk about that, intersection of image and text that is such a powerful way of communicating right now. And to try and rebuild the trust in the community is, it's just like you were saying, Alicia, it's like, you jump in, snap a picture and jump out. It's like, there's no way, I don't care like how good a photographer you are, like the camera only records what you see, and you can't see somebody unless you know them. You can't know someone unless you spend the time. So, to me, I think like breaking it down into sort of hyper-specific categories for me is the mark of some of the really successful small startups, like 100 Days in Appalachia, like we talked about the Shoestring, like Shoestring has dedicated accountability reporter who goes to all the city council meetings. Yeah, there's quite a few like small outlets, but the funding thing is still a serious issue. And if you're committed to cutting trees down and hauling them 500 miles and turning them into paper and putting ink on them, that's a serious, funding question as well. So yeah, there's no easy answers for sure.
And on the question of funding, there are some great questions here. I don't have an answer to. Jeff Jones, local labor leader here in the area, asked, is there a way to buy out the current owners and have the actual workers become a co-op of worker owners? Boy, sounds amazing to me. The Pioneer Valley is examples of business conversions to this model. Obviously, I don't think we have all the answers to these things here, but I think it's important to raise these questions and to begin the process of trying to figure out what those best solutions are. Representative McGovern, I'm going to put the same question to you. What does a stronger Gazette look like to you?
It's a paper that holds everybody accountable, all the time. And it's a paper when we're not talking about what was not covered or what voices haven't been heard, but where we're celebrating, all the incredible journalism. And, just one other thing, I mean, I'm not sure how many of you have been following the news about what happened in Australia, where Australia basically has passed a law saying that Google has to pay for the news content, that it puts on its, on Facebook, but whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Medium, or Google, they ought to pay for the work that you do. And that may be one way to get some more resources into our local news. And it's something that on a national level, we ought to be looking into. But again, thank you for doing this. And I think this is a worthy cause. And I hope that people, respond because you know what, sometimes we take for granted what we have, but when we lose it, you can't get it back. And so it's important that we fight to protect the Gazette and the great journalists and the photographers and all the people who work there. So I'm happy to be part of this effort. So thank you.
And thank you. We'll continue on with that same question to Alicia Fleming. Alicia, briefly, what does a stronger Gazette look like to you?
A Gazette that supports its workers. I think that is, really where I'm at. I want to see newspapers that support their workers. I want to see Gazette coverage that tells the stories and amplifies the voices of other workers in our region. I want to hear from essential workers. I want to hear from our healers, our nurses, and the people who are working in our hospitals and healing institutions. I want to hear from, the workers of UFCW 1459 and know, that everything is okay when they're at work. I want a Gazette that supports the community and supports the workers and relationships that are more reciprocal, because that's really what it should be.
I can second that. Let's go to Lindsey Sabadosa, and then we'll end with Shaheen Pasha. Lindsey Sabadosa, what does a stronger Gazette look like to you?
Hard to answer after everybody said such great things, but I guess I'd take it a step further. I'd like to see a Gazette that's owned by its workers. I'd like to see a Gazette that is fully and totally accountable to its community, where I open the pages and I see stories that have regular people living their lives that tell me what is going on, and that a Gazette where there's no longer a disconnect between what I hear in my office every day and what I see on the pages of the local newspaper.
Absolutely. I see Ben posting in the comments about the Colorado Sun. There's so many interesting models we could be thinking about here. There are worker-owned co-ops, as Representative Sabadosa notes. There are subscriber-owned co-ops that have been started in places across the country. I don't know what the answers are here, but I think we've got a lot of smart people in this community who maybe can help us figure out what are those answers. Lastly, we can go to Shaheen Pasha and tell us what you think a stronger Gazette would look like.
I think a stronger Gazette is one, well, there's a few. I think one of the main things is that we need to be investing in our employees and giving our reporters and our staff more, I guess, prominence to be able to do what they need to do best. They need to be able to get into the community. We need to be supporting them leaving the desk. Okay, as a reporter, that's what we need. We need them in the community. I think we need to have we need to be able to focus on larger and longer term stories. When it comes to that, I think in terms of funding, a Gazette that I would like to see is one that looks at alternative models, one that is becoming very active and looking at the different models that are out there, whether it is a co-op, whether it's a nonprofit, whatever, subscription models, whatever it is that you want to look and create different model types to be able to see which one works best for the community and for the reporters and the staff that are there. So I think the ideal Gazette that I would like to see is one that's thriving. I mean, I think that's really what comes down to it. Right now, it's been decimated, and that to me is heartbreaking. And I still follow the Gazette. I'm here in Penn State. I still read it. I'm still subscribed to it. I still read it all the time. And I think that when people are invested in the community, even when they leave the community, they continue to care. So I want to see a Gazette that will continue to be able to do the work that it has done in just a thriving environment where people are just happy. And I think no one's happy right now.
I think you're right. On that note, I want to say that this process of continuing to envision a better future for the Gazette is just starting now. This will, however, be the end of this first step, the forum. We'll continue to ask users of New England to engage in this conversation, and that begins with a stakeholder working group, as we've mentioned. We're hoping to hold in the near future. Again, if you're interested in that, we'll be sure to reach out to us at pvnewsguild at gmail.com. Again, that's pvnewsguild@gmail.com. If you're interested in that event, obviously reach out to us or feel like you contribute in any way to that process. We also ask that you keep an eye open as the Gazette's workers continue to bargain for a fair contract. We're now 2 years into contract negotiations with newspapers in New England. We need all the help we can get. I want to thank all of our panelists tonight for spending an hour and a half with us, dealing with some really great questions from the public and from our members, Representative McGovern, Representative Sabadosa, Shaheen Pasha, Alicia Fleming, Ben Brody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Dusty Christensen from the Pioneer Valley News Guild. Good night, everybody.